Hey everyone, welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Jane Roper, and with me today we have Ryan Hampton, author of Unsettled, How the Purdue Pharma Bankruptcy Failed the Victims of the American Overdose Crisis. Ryan is an author, speaker, addiction recovery advocate who is himself in recovery from a decade-long opioid addiction, an alumnus of the Clinton White House. He's worked with multiple nonprofits and national recovery advocacy campaigns. In 2016, he created the web series Addiction Across America, documenting his 30-day, 28-state, 8,000-mile cross-country trip visiting the areas hardest hit by the addiction crisis. His first book, American Fix, Inside the Opioid Addiction Crisis and How to End It, was published in August 2018. His new book, published last month, is Unsettled. In 2019, Purdue Pharma, the makers of Oxycontin, controlled by the now infamous Sackler family, filed for bankruptcy to protect itself from hundreds of lawsuits. Ryan served as co-chair of the official Creditors Committee that acted as a watchdog during the process. He entered the case believing that exposing the Sackler family and mobilizing against Purdue would be enough to right the scales of justice, but found out that, unfortunately, that was not exactly the case. In the book, he writes, "This wasn't a bankruptcy, it was a heist." Ryan, thank you for being with us today. It's good to have you.
Jane, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get into the case, which, as I wrote when I was promoting this, made me absolutely livid to read about, I'd love to tell us a little bit more about you and your background and how you came to be an advocate for addiction recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. You know, it's an interesting time that I'm in right now for my recovery, because between Halloween 2014 to Thanksgiving 2014, I was homeless, right? I mean, I was homeless for time before that, but during those 26 days, I was actually walking to a payphone to make a phone call to a public facility in North Los Angeles to see if they had a bed for me. And I became, before my addiction story, you know, I was an up and comer kind of in politics and in public policy. As you mentioned, I had worked in the Clinton administration. I'm an alumnus there, worked for labor organizations, worked on several campaigns for governor and Congress. And then in 2003, as a result of a hiking injury, where I injured my knee and injured my ankle, I was prescribed a high-grade opioid. I had moved back to Florida shortly after that injury and got caught up in the pill mill epidemic, which was a real thing. You know, people need to realize, like, the pill mills were a real thing. There were more pill clinics, pill mills, pain-specific pharmacies in South Florida than there were McDonald's or 7-Elevens at the time. And I got caught up in that cycle really bad. And that's where I had my first introduction to Oxycontin, which really led to a very steep, quick, not very protracted journey of substance use disorder and addiction that led to my first bouts with homelessness and loss of job, loss of housing, loss of health insurance, you know, isolation from family members and friends and those closest to me. And in 2008, I was abruptly cut off from the Oxycontin as a result of the first iteration of what was called the Physician Drug Monitoring Database, which was the state's way of trying to deal with all these prescription overdoses. The problem was it was a database that was tracking users and it was tracking our prescriptions. And when we were caught up in that database, they weren't just saying, hey, you might have a problem, you should go get help. They were just kicking us off the rolls. And it led me into heroin use and IV heroin use. And
I mean, you'd think they would have predicted that, right?
You would have thought so. But I mean, it really was this simplistic view of the government of how to deal with this, which is something they had been doing for a long time, which was just cut off the supply and the demand will deal with itself, right? No, you deal with the demand first, right? You offer people help and resources. That same attitude, I think, played out in the Purdue bankruptcy. It's playing out in legislative and regulatory fixes across the country right now. There's a little bit of a better understanding, but we have a long way to go. And to make a very long story short, that led to overdoses. That led to me being in Los Angeles, homeless, helpless, begging for a way out. And I finally found that way out is, thanks to Medicaid, thanks to public services. But my advocacy in this space, my advocacy in community organizing, my involvement in the Purdue case and around the opioid litigation and fighting for communities wasn't as a result of just my experience. It was watching friends of mine die when I got sober, watching them die, being turned away at hospital rooms when they're asking for help, watching them die when they're being kicked out of housing and being, turned away at treatment facilities where they should be given on-demand, equitable, access to healthcare supports that could save their lives. And that made me angry. And I was able to draw kind of a straight line in the beginning based on my experience with Oxycontin to Purdue and the Sackler family, and really got heavily involved in activism around that company and holding them accountable, which ultimately led me to the Creditors Committee and the appointment by the DOJ in September of 2019, where I thought at the time I might be able to get some measure of justice for our community. But boy, was I mistaken that bankruptcy system was nothing about justice. It was nothing about facts. It was nothing about holding people accountable. It was about money, and it was about power. And it's one of the biggest, most colossal injustices of public health in the history of the United States, if you ask me.
Yes, absolutely. That was the sense I got. Would you excuse me for just a moment? I'm having some background noise and I want to see what it is.
Sure, of course.
All right. Sorry about that.
Hey, that's the world we live in, right?
I know, right? Like,
yeah.
Shut up. All right. Well, anyway. So, now at the beginning of your book, before we jump into the case again, one other thing I wanted to get a little background from you on was the way that Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family really created the demand that you're talking about. I was really astonished. I certainly knew before that there was a lot of stuff happening to push the use of OxyContin on, incentivize and encourage doctors to prescribe it. But I was really kind of amazed at some of the tactics that Arthur Sackler and Purdue Pharma used. Can you talk a little bit about how they helped create that demand?
Well, I think in a perfect world, at the heart of it, at the crux of it, and there's other great books who have focused on kind of the genesis and the beginning of Purdue. They figured out how to market narcotics, right? The same way we market Coca-Cola or McDonald's hamburgers or other, consumer-based products, right? And a lot of that marketing wasn't just questionable, it was criminal.
Yeah.
It was criminal. It was misleading. Now, they were able to weaponize the American medicine cabinet through this marketing with this medication using a lie, right? That the medication was not addictive or was so, the chance of being addicted was so low that it outweighed the benefit of using the drug. And you saw many prescribers starting to prescribe Oxycontin for things that weren't just related to pain. Like Oxycontin was kind of seen as this cure-all medication for everything. And it was popping up in American medicine cabinets. As a result of that, unscrupulous doctors were going into these pain businesses. Doctors were coming out of retirement, right, to go into pain businesses. Most of them were only, cash only. But one of the real crimes here, though, was that once the data started to show and people were ending up dead with prescriptions for Oxycontin in their pocket in West Virginia and in Appalachia and in Florida where I was, and the DEA was armed with the information of this influx of pills that was happening and and the diversion that was happening, you could envision a perfect world where in 2007, when the Department of Justice indicted Purdue and Purdue pled guilty and executives from the company pled guilty to criminal charges, that things would have changed.
Yes.
Right? Like you could envision this world where it would have stopped. Purdue would have gotten back in line, gotten into a straight line. Government regulators would have done their jobs. States would have been monitoring, misuse of Oxycontin. There would have been more transparency. But it got worse.
Right.
It got worse. The crimes continued. They continued, and they piled on, and the deaths continued, right? And that's what was, I think, most upsetting to me, is that we were armed with this information, and the people who were supposed to protect us were asleep at the wheel.
Right.
And now at the end of this case, right, I have friends who are serving time in jail and prison for simple possession charges, and they're not drug traffickers. They're just users themselves, right? Who weren't offered help, who have been victimized by this system, who will serve 18 months, 2 years in federal prison for these low-level crimes, right? Non-violent crimes, non-white-collar crimes. The Sacklers have yet to sit for a grand jury. They have yet to be indicted, right? They won't be. In my opinion, if you ask me, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. It's not just a heist. This entire process was a sham.
Yeah. And the Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy as a way to avoid some accountability as well, right? They did this. They had all these lawsuits against them. So this was kind of a way for them to weasel out of that, isn't it?
Right. So it's a great point. So they were originally kind of bundled into the multi-district litigation, which is happening in Judge Polster's courtroom in Ohio. A lot of news around that, by the way, recently around the Oklahoma Supreme Court overturning the $465 million judgment, and the California, judge, opioid manufacturers and distributors winning there based on this nuisance test that they were using. But this was back in 2019. And Purdue essentially pulled the ripcord because they saw their potential liability was more than the money they had in the bank. They saw bankruptcy as kind of an escape route. They pulled the ripcord, removed themselves from the multi-district litigation into corporation, capitalist-friendly, White Plains, New York, under the direction of Judge Robert D. Drain, because they knew they could get a non-consensual third-party release for any civil claims, future civil claims, and past civil claims against the Sackler family. And they knew that this judge would favor the company, would favor the corporation. Now, a lot of us thought, though, in September 2019, when they filed for bankruptcy, I know, the headlines would make you believe Purdue files for bankruptcy, has to go into a settlement with the states, has to go into a settlement with creditors. The company's no longer to exist. People think bankruptcy, they think company's not going to exist anymore, right?
Of course, right.
Justice will be done.
Right.
That's not what happened. Purdue is going to exist in another form, in a new company. It's going to continue producing Oxycontin because it has to.
Right.
Because without Oxycontin, there is no settlement. And the only folks who are actually really making out like bandits here are the lawyers.
Yes.
I mean, there's one law firm in New York that is going to, on like 200 attorneys that worked on this case, they're going to, in the last year and a half, will have netted twice as much money as the state of Massachusetts will receive in total in its abatement plan. Lawyers will make over $1.2 to $1.3 billion, less than 1,000 of them, lawyers and consultants, while victims, over 130,000 victims who were harmed by Oxycontin, who have legitimate claims in this bankruptcy, will share in $750 million. The average family will take home $5,000 before lawyers' fees for the harm that's been caused, right? There's a similar a comparable bankruptcy around an auto manufacturer of recent around faulty seatbelts. And in that bankruptcy, individuals who were harmed by this seatbelt, by this company that went into bankruptcy and had as much of a bruise, will receive more compensation than a mother or a father who lost their child to an overdose from Oxycontin. This process was set up to favor the powerful and the wealthy and the corporations and the governments. The victims will only take 7.5% of the settlement.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Now,
that is the real crime.
yeah.
The real crime here is that the system is set up to let folks like the Sacklers and Purdue walk away unscathed. The Sacklers will actually be richer, have more wealth at the end of the 9 years after paying back the settlement because of their investments. Right? They'll have approximately $1 billion more in the bank after paying back this settlement. Right. And 92.5% of it's going to go to corporations and government. And us victims will never have the opportunity to sue the Sacklers or Purdue or any of the other pharmas for that matter, because they're going to get releases in the MDL. The whole thing is just insanity.
And you saw that, you got a upfront seat for that right at the beginning, right? So you were part of this 9-member committee, creditor committee, right? And I was astonished to see that there were 4 victims on it, but then the other 5 were these big players. Tell us a bit about that community, that committee, and how that worked.
Yeah, the makeup of the committee was 4 victims, right? It was myself, a mother of loss who I write about in detail, a dear friend Cheryl Jouer, Carol Trainer, who has a son impacted by NAS and neonatal abstinence syndrome, and then Walter Lee Salmons, who was a grandfather with grandchildren impacted by NAS. And the other 5 members were corporate representatives, right? So it was big insurance companies, big hospitals, CVS, who is a defendant in the opioid litigation themselves, saying that they had been harmed by Purdue as a result of unpaid rebates. Those 5 corporate representatives, one of the things that was astonishing to me is the lawyers, it was like a club. I mean, like they all had been doing business and running these bankruptcy rackets together for a long time. And it was like, it felt like they were pros at it. They just jumped from bankruptcy to bankruptcy. And it's like, let's see who can collect as much. And, their interests were not in line with public health, right? Their interest was get as much money as possible for my client, which is this big mega corporation, right? Their interest wasn't in making sure that victims were compensated. The same thing with attorneys general, though, because they were the big creditors in the case. Like there was a different standard for them than there was for victims. Victims were doubly victimized in this process. I mean, some of the same attorneys general who went in front of microphones and said they were fighting Purdue and the Sacklers for justice for victims and for families and communities that were harmed, behind closed doors would be making the argument that victims deserve nothing, that the states should take claim to all the money because they're the ones providing the healthcare services and the social services and the criminal justice services and the law enforcement services, that they had some sort of a administrative claim over victims' claims. And then they would make wild, assumptions that if we give addicts money, they're just going to spend it on drugs, which is just bonkers, right? I mean, just a bonkers argument, in my opinion. And it's none of their business what people do with their money anyway. We're entitled to it, right? Family members are entitled to it. But at their core argument was that we did this to ourselves.
Right. Well, and that was what really struck me too, is we'd like to think, there's been so much awareness around, destigmatization, but really, I think in a lot of people's minds, there still is this idea that the people who became addicted were themselves culpable when that's really not the case.
Right. The stigma, I think, there's indicators that stigma and bias against people in recovery, those impacted by addiction, people who use drugs, is getting better, right? In the public forum, like we can see it. I mean, you're seeing it in popular culture, more books, more people being listened to, more voices. This is a long time coming, right? People are coming out of the shadows. But in my opinion and experience, where it really matters, which is in those closed door meetings and, in legislation and in negotiations like we saw during the opioid litigation with Purdue Pharma, outside of the public eye where some of these very important decisions are made, stigma is alive and well. And when money is on the table, it's even it's worse than it used to be, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, the stigma is used as a reason, to keep dollars away
Right.
from folks who have been harmed the most. That was my experience in Purdue. And I mean,
Yeah.
it was one of the most telling, I think, stories coming out of the book was that what we were being fed by the media, what we were being fed by some of these government institutions and players was all hogwash.
Right.
Because this wasn't about the truth. This wasn't about justice. This was about who can get the most money.
Right. It seems like, you went into this to some degree with your eyes open, right? You've been working as an activist for a while. You led a protest, I think, outside of Purdue Pharma at one point.
In August of 2018, 500
Okay,
people with Cheryl. That's how Cheryl and I met for the first time. I mean,
really?
We organized this protest together in front of Purdue, and 500 families that showed up, and we actually delivered a letter to Craig Landau that said, that Purdue needed to divest its profits into harm reduction, into treatment, into support for families, into support for communities that have been harmed. To this day, that letter remains unanswered.
Really? Wow. Unbelievable. But it seems like, this whole process really took you to a new level of anger and frustration. It seems like your eyes were really opened to some things and some not very pleasant things. And you started to see it more as a larger systemic problem. You wrote at the end of the book, Purdue had many accomplices in the release of the Sacklers. This would not have happened in a just system, yet until we reform our system, it can never be just, equal, or fair. What kind of reforms do you think need to happen to prevent this sort of thing from happening again?
Yeah. Walking into the case, I literally thought we were all on the same side. If you thought of like a long conference table, I literally envisioned it in my head, like victims, activists, advocates, attorneys general, lawyers, companies, insurance companies, like we're all, and then the Sacklers and Purdue on the other side, and we're all fighting the same fight.
That'd be a great movie. That would be the movie version, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was my belief. And I really, was I naive? Yes. Coming out of this though, as angry as I am about what's happening, right? As angry as I am that the Sacklers are riding off into the sunset with no measure of justice for our communities, angry as I am about the paltry sum of money that victims will receive, or how the plan of reorganization is designed, or the fact that Purdue was able to pick their judge. Look, if I'm arrested or someone sues me, I don't get to go to a drawing board and pick the best judge that'll work for me. But that's exactly what Purdue and the Sacklers got to do. All of these things. The system was designed that way.
Yeah.
Like, and I didn't understand this. The system was, I mean, the ridiculous amount of money that lawyers and consultants and the tort and like all of that, like that's how the system's designed. That's how the bankruptcy system is designed. That's how, corporate litigation is designed. This is, they were playing by the rules.
Right.
To them. And like, the more that I internalized that, I realized that everything we're experiencing, the overdose crisis, the healthcare crisis, the disparity in wealth in this country is by design.
Right.
And it was this wake up moment for me that if we're going to prevent this from ever happening again and because if we don't change the bankruptcy system, like there will be another Sackler family, there will be another Purdue Pharma. It may not be. I mean, we're seeing it play out in Boy Scouts, right? We're seeing it play out in J&J right now around the talc. We're seeing it play out in the Weinstein case. Like, if we don't find a way to reform this system, it will continue repeating itself. So what does that look like? We've got to get rid of this venue shopping. That corporations get to pick their judges.
Pick
their venues. I mean, it is insane. It is unjust. It is wrong. We've got to make it harder for bad actors such as the Sacklers to obtain these non-consensual third-party releases. At the very minimum, there should be a layer of judicial review. This is something that Congress is taking up right now, and House Judiciary passed yesterday. I believe it's waiting for a floor vote. However, in doing that, we need to make sure that we're not creating more harm for victims who already have settlements in place, right? We need to find a way to protect those victim settlements that exist, because if that, if some of this legislation is passed without some tweaks to it, victims could actually stand to receive nothing in many of these cases where they've been harmed. And so taking on the third-party releases, but at the same time, we've got to take on the fact that when there is a bankruptcy case where individual human beings have been harmed, like they were in Purdue or in Weinstein or in Boy Scouts, right? That those victims should not have to get in line behind big corporations and government to prove that they've been harmed more. Victims should be centered first. They should be first in line for settlement amounts, and they should be in first in line to get paid. It is unconscionable, and absolutely insane to envision a world where, and this happened in Purdue and is happening in Purdue right now, where a mother or a father who lost their child to Oxycontin has to prove that their claim is more important than the government's claim or than CVS's claim or than Blue Cross Blue Shield's claim. This is what's happening right now. By default, those victims should be at the top of the food chain. And I know a lot of people will say, but the government is using the money to build a better system, to make sure there's better treatment, to make sure there's better infrastructure. And I say, bravo, we need to build that better system, but I also pay taxes for those services.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there people within the system, people in the government, any attorneys general, or anyone that you see who is working toward the kind of thing, the reforms that you're talking about? Is there anyone in the inside?
I think there are. I would put it more on Congress right now. A lot of this legislation, actually, some of it's going to get through in the House. It's going to get through in the Judiciary Committee. It's probably going to get voted on the House. I know the prohibition on non-consensual third-party releases is now sitting for a vote in the full House. The real fight's going to be in the Senate, though. And as you know, like the Senate's kind of it's a mess right now with a lot of stuff. So it's going to have to get taken up by the Senate and Senate Judiciary. A lot of reforms, though, need to be done on those bills, I think, before they make their way to the president for his signature. I'm hoping that, given the level, I think any bankruptcy attorney, or someone who studies bankruptcy, law professors and et cetera, can't believe that this has become such a big issue in 2021. And it is because of the high profile cases. But it's my hope that in 2022, right, and in the new Congress that comes in 2022 and 2023, that we can really see meaningful reform, not just lip service, because I think we've been getting lip service on bankruptcy reform for a long time, because let's not kid ourselves. Like, the financial industry is very powerful.
Of course.
The United States Chamber of Commerce is very powerful.
Sure.
And they love the system the way that it exists right now, because it benefits their membership, their clients. It benefits kind of this attitude of reckless capitalism that I think exists in the United States today. But more important than the legislators or the attorneys general, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book, right, and I wrote Unsettled, and one of my big hopes for Unsettled coming out of it is that these regulators, these lawmakers, will engage people who have experienced the harm of these systems to help guide what this legislation should look like, right? So, like, I would like for some of this experience coming out of Purdue to really be examined from the inside perspective that will guide how this legislation could look, right? Because there could be unintended harms to actual victims if all perspectives are not brought into the same tent, right? And our legislators haven't done a very good job at that, right? Like, they think they have all the answers, which is how we got ourselves into this mess in the first place.
Well, it sounds like you're in a, you're being the squeaky wheel and trying to get into, trying to keep doing that and trying to keep advocating, and which is fantastic. What are your plans next for, do you see another book? Do you see continuing with advocacy? Are you going to run for office? What's next for you?
I'm not going to run for office. I'll tell you that right now. That's not in the cards in the near future. So a no to that. And I think my fiance, Sean, if he was listening, would probably have a heart attack if he was. I don't know. The thing with the book is it's I'd love to write another book, but I mean, it's if the opportunity presents itself, and the issue, and there's something that I feel, would be of use in the hands of the American public as a tool, right? Because I look at my books, and it was what American Fix was about, which was a call to action. Unsettled is very much a call to action and offering a layer of transparency that just does not exist in the bankruptcy process. And through the Purdue case, through the form of a book. If there was another opportunity like that, I would definitely consider it. And time will tell. Time will tell. The ground is shifting beneath us with respect to the overdose crisis, and I think the narrative is shifting as well. Right. And so time will tell. If there's an opportunity, and I think it will do good. And serve as a platform for some reform or action, I would absolutely consider it. But in the short term, I'm very much looking forward to staying closer to home, and my hometown is Las Vegas, Nevada. I think I wrote about it in Unsettled that I wish I would have had more attention closer to home and local advocacy, rather than spending all this time in the Purdue bankruptcy, because coming out of it, I feel like it was a tremendous waste of time.
Right.
And I lost a lot of friends this year to overdoses,
I'm sure that the pandemic has made that crisis that much worse.
The pandemic and government inaction on the overdose crisis has made it worse. The pandemic has been had an extraordinary impact on this community, but for every 8 COVID deaths, there's 1 overdose death.
Really?
Yet federal spending and federal investment on combating the overdose crisis is 700 times less than what it is on COVID. And this isn't to take away from COVID, because we have 2 public health crises in this country, one being COVID, the other one being 2 declared ones, and the other being the overdose crisis. So really, I hope that over the next year and kind of in the short term, really focusing on bringing more attention to that, but working on the things that saved my own life and advocating for those in my own community, right? Housing, equitable treatment, harm reduction supports, peer support services, family support services. We need those in Clark County, Nevada, just as much as we need them anywhere else in the country. And I want to, I really want to put my effort where I think it will be most of use and most valued, which is helping those in my community and folks closest to me. I can't, the level of grief and just loss this last year has been tremendous. I wrote about some of my friends in the book that died while I was writing the book. And, I want to do the best that I can this year to do the most good that I can.
It's interesting how sometimes when we try to go up against the system, it can be so overpowering and so disheartening that you really do end up sort of trying to bring it back home and bring it to a place where you feel like you can actually have some real tangible victories, maybe, both for your own sense of, your own mental health, but also your own, for the sense that you're touching individual lives, whereas sometimes those big issues can become overwhelming.
My experience in the case and in writing Unsettled really, I had a lot of questions about the world we live in, but it also altered in a sense, my purpose and where my place in this world really is, right? Where it should be. In the long term. And that's what I want to focus on.
That's great. Yeah. So it sort of brought you back home in a way, which is probably both ultimately a good thing, although it came from a frustrating situation. I finally, before we go, just want to acknowledge that part of why we chose to do this interview today is it is Veterans Day, and the veteran community has been, extremely impacted by opioid substance abuse issues and overdoses. Do you want to just speak briefly to that and maybe why that exists and what's being done?
Yeah. Sadly, the veteran community is disproportionately impacted by substance use disorder and also suicide.
Yeah.
And this is, a result of a lot of trauma, obviously, but it's also the result of, the VA and a lot of these health plans not having any other option for some of these veterans other than opioids. Right now, opioids aren't, inherently bad, right? Some people do need them, absolutely. Sure. But there's been some studies on how just excessive, the VA plans and others really relied on opioids as a crutch, right? We have to do more for the veterans community when it comes to substance use disorder, recovery, treatment, mental health. Yes. Right? These are individuals. I come from a family of soldiers, from my lineage, from my grandfather to my sister. I mean, who have served and who have fought for this country. But when they come home and they need help and they need mental health care and they need pain care and they need supportive services and they need housing, those things aren't there. Right. All of the social determinants of health that lead to substance use disorder, substance misuse, overdose are highlighted within the veterans community because we don't take care of them.
Right.
And it is a crime, and we have got to do better with that. Yeah. That's why one of the things that I advocate for and work so hard for are these recovery community organizations, these recovery support services, these peer support services. Mm-hmm. Some of the largest consumers of those services, which are nonprofit, free of charge. And then there's Medicaid options for people who need, further support through mental health or treatment. They service a huge veterans population. They do things that some hospitals can't. They do things that sometimes the VA can't. That peer-to-peer support is critical for the veterans community. We have got to build a better peer workforce in this country and invest in that. These are all things that we could have done with this bankruptcy money, that we could have done with this opioid litigation money. But sadly, the folks who make those decisions, government institutions and these power players, wanted nothing of it. So there's so much more that we can do. And there are resources out there for veterans. I would, encourage anyone who's struggling, and looking for help with mental health or substance use disorder to go to gettreatment.gov, which is the federal government's treatment locator. Great services there. The best that we have right now. We need to do more. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. We have failed our veterans when it comes to this issue.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that in the future, thanks to the work of folks like you and the many others who are doing it, that we can do better. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us. The book is Unsettled. You can grab it anywhere books are sold, of course. Really a riveting read. We'll put up a link to bookshop.org. You can support your local independent bookstore. Thanks again, Ryan. All the best to you, and really appreciate your being here.